This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by supporters like you. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the efforts here at Trifles. Just go to patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 345, Animal Cruelty. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you mangy mutt, you cur, you... I don't know. I'm not good at animal abuse.
Well, thank goodness you're not good at animal husbandry, because we would have to put this podcast in a whole other different category.
Until they caught him at it one day, yes. Well, this should be interesting. This is something that was spurred on by, I think it was our discussion in a few quick ones in episode 341, where we talked about the Airedale Terrier that Holmes needed to foist through, not Holmes, who was it? Murdoch had to throw through the plate glass window.
Ian Murdoch in the Lion's Mane.
In the Lion's Mane, that's right. It got us to thinking about, well, what other instances were there in the Sherlock Holmes stories where we can witness or look at the consequences of animals being abused? It's not necessarily a happy subject, but we thought it was one worth exploring anyway.
Yes.
The show notes for this episode are available at ihos.co/trifles345. There you can find everything that you have come to expect to find from us here. That is the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, the ability to sign up for email updates, as well as the ability to support us on Patreon. As you know, all of our patrons get to listen to the shows ad-free, and at the end of every month, there is a drawing for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and at the end of every quarter, there is a drawing for a free annual subscription to the BSJ, and only our patrons are eligible for those drawings. So if you would like to join the other generous donors that we have for as little as $1 a month, you can support the show and possibly win a big prize. Well, animal cruelty is our subject here, Burt. Gosh, where to begin this unhappy topic?
Where I would like to begin, in our last episode of Trifles, we were wandering through the pages of Memories and Adventures, because we were then and this is Conan Doyle's early 1920s memoir, and we were talking about his experiences with motor cars and motor car accidents. But there's also something very illuminating about his attitude about animals, which you wouldn't necessarily understand had you just been confronted by the number of incidents in which animals are poorly treated in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. But this, I think, is more a commentary on life in England at the time and the behavior of people than Conan Doyle's own attitude, because he writes in Memories and Adventures, I cannot persuade myself that we are justified in taking life as a pleasure. To shoot for the pot must be right, since man must feed, and to kill creatures which live upon others. The hunting of foxes, for example, must also be right, since to slay one is to save many. But the rearing of birds in order to kill them, and the shooting of such sensitive and inoffensive animals as hares and deer, cannot, I think, be justified. I must admit that I shot a good deal before I came to this conclusion. So that perhaps gives my opinion greater weight. And I know nothing more exhilarating than to wait on the borders of an autumn-tinted wood, to hear the crackling advance of beaters, to mark the sudden whir and the yell of mark over and then over the topmost branches, to see a noble pheasant whizzing downwind at a pace which pitches him 100 yards behind you. But when your moment of exultation is over and you note what a beautiful creature he is, and how one instant of your pleasure has wrecked him, you feel that you had better think no longer if you mean to slip 2 more cartridges into your gun and stand by for another. Worse still is it when you hear the childlike wail of the wounded hare. I should think that there are few sportsmen who have not felt a disgust at their own handiwork when they've heard it. And so, too, when you see the pheasant fly on with his legs showing beneath him as a sign that he's hard hit, and he drops into the thick woods and is lost to sight, perhaps it's well for your peace of mind that he should be lost to thought also.
Wow. That was surprisingly self-aware and modern for a man of Victorian and Edwardian ages.
Yeah, and bear in mind, too, that, in his Arctic voyage, he had experiences with whales and bears. But, too, what's interesting in that is the way he starts out describing that in the passage of Memories and Adventures. It's almost like he's put his reasoning in real time down on the page. This must be right, because, after all, it's food, but that doesn't seem, it's just interesting the way this came out of his came out of his mind and through his pen and down onto the page.
Yeah, it really does. I have to I have to admit to this. The other day I was having a debate with someone, and they said, we were talking about creationism and Noah's Ark, and which is largely an apocryphal story. I mean, there have been many floods, but to think that we got every phylum of animal into a single vessel and saved, it's obviously apocryphal, but it's meant to tell a bigger story. But the person said, how long after the ark came to settle on the tip of Mount Ararat, how long did the carnivores have to wait before they began eating each other? I said, that's a good question. They needed to repopulate the species to a certain point, but they must have been really hungry before then.
Well, I must admit, I've never thought of that.
I hadn't either, which is why it stood out.
Yeah.
But, back in Conan Doyle's time, there wasn't as much thought given to the treatment of animals. I mean, even as far as 1936, I was just reading something about the Charge of the Light Brigade in 1936, directed by Michael Curtiz, starring Errol Flynn. And, of course, famously, as they filmed the climax, Curtiz had arranged for a tripwire to be set up, and 125 horses were tripped, and 25 of the horses were injured so badly in that scene that they had to be put down afterwards. And it was the beginning of the awareness of treating animals humanely in the production of film at that point. So, but of course, we have instances other than the Airedale Terrier being hurled through a plate glass window in the canon, and I think we'll kind of enumerate some of those and challenge our listeners to see if they can come up with any that we've missed right after this quick break. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Okay, we are back, sadly, talking about animal cruelty. You know, Bert, it strikes me that before the break you were talking about Conan Doyle and his Arctic voyage. I believe there was an instance, and we talked about this in our interview with John Lullenberg and Dan Stasauer back in episode 48 of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, in which we talked to them about Dangerous Work, which was Conan Doyle's diary of an Arctic adventure. I seem to recall there was some scene that he sketched in his diary with seals having been clubbed and blood on the snow and everything. It was a very bloody scene from what I recall in his description.
Well, yes, absolutely.
I don't know if that sparks anything with you, if you remember that.
Well, I do remember that. You know, what I remember most about that conversation is that, well, I remember really just two or three things about that. The fascinating thing about that is that he completed this diary, which until John and Dan, with the help of Charles Foley, I believe, published it, it really had been little seen and little known and little recognized. And it's in there that, in that diary, that when he returns finally from this voyage, because what happens here is that Conan Doyle interrupts his medical studies to become the ship's physician in this Arctic whaler. And when he returns at the end of it, they stop at a port and they get a newspaper and they first read about the disaster at Maiwand, which is where Watson was wounded. And so finding that link to Watson's military service was so important to Dan, and to John. So I remember that. But I also remember, of course, Conan Doyle slipping on the ice and winding up at least once and probably more frequently in the drink. And how lucky we are, particularly as John Lullenberg pointed out in that conversation, that he didn't disappear into the Arctic ice and live to write Brigadier Gerard and Sherlock Holmes and everything else.
That's an excellent point. I mean, we are fortunate that Conan Doyle survived that instance. It does look like an agreement between Britain and Norway prohibited seal hunting until after the March breeding season, as they write. So the crew used the time to track schools of seals to the main pack. Once you do come upon it, it's a wonderful sight from the crow's nest at the top mainmast, Conan Doyle writes. One can see no end of them. On the furthest visible ice, one can see a sprinkling of pepper grains, and the Hope was one of the first to find the seal pack that year. So, then it goes on. So, that's Conan Doyle's own experience. Well, let's turn to the canon. What instances in the Sherlock Holmes stories do we have of animals being maltreated?
Well, maltreated, if we just want to focus on maltreatment, there are a couple of big ones. First of all, the Hound of the Baskervilles, who is starved and abused in a variety of ways to make him even more fierce and deadly. And that has an analog in the Copper Beeches in Carlo the Mastiff, whose fangs terrify and who's lurching around the grounds at night, terrify poor Violet Hunter, because Jeffro Rucastle has employed his Mastiff, and Toller, the drunken groom, is the only one who can do anything with him by way of keeping his daughter's boyfriend off the premises, I gather.
Yeah. I think Toller fed him once a day, and as Rucastle described it, it was designed to keep Carlo as keen as mustard. There was another Carlo as well, speaking of abused dogs, who was suffering at the hands of a member of the family. That was in The Sussex Vampire. Bob Ferguson had a number of South American souvenirs lying around, and I guess those included some poison-tipped arrows. And young Jackie Ferguson was trying them out and turned to old Carlo, the Hound. And Carlo was experiencing some paralysis in his hindquarters. And Ferguson didn't connect the dots as to what that might have been coming from, and Holmes immediately drew the conclusion that it was young Jackie testing it out on Carlo and then using it on the baby as well.
Yeah, well, you see, Ferguson's keen judgment, which led him, of course, to keep poison-tipped arrows lying around in the first place, must have failed him when he couldn't put two and two together and say, wait a minute, hold on a second, limping paralysis? I'm mystified.
It makes you wonder if he actually knew what he had on his hands at that point.
Well, we see this sort of pop up at different times when it's a component of the actions of a case of Sherlock Holmes, particularly with Dr. Leon Sterndale, who seems to have, for no real apparent reason, brought a load of Radix pedestiabile to England. Perhaps he wanted to show that to Brenda. Brenda, let me tell you a little bit about the rituals of the tribes in which I've experienced, and try a little pinch of this, my dear.
Just a pinch. Yeah,
just a pinch.
A little dab will do you. Oh, well, that idea of experimenting on an animal before trying the actual affliction of harm, that is a method we see in Silver Blaze as well. When Holmes hears of a few of the sheep being said to be lame, he realized that Straker was testing out the cataract knife on the sheep first before he decided to attempt the same on the horse. So again, being able to observe what else is going on and seeing where it applies.
Yeah, and there are a couple of other cases there too. For example, the line and the engagement of characters in the canon with animals is a blurry one. We have, for example, the evil Dr. Grimsby Roylott from the Speckled Band, who has this menagerie of animals that really can't be all that comfortable and happy in the English climate, wandering around the premises there, I guess also to keep suitors away from his stepdaughters.
Yeah, Rucastle used a dog. Roylott used a cheetah and a baboon. I mean, Of course. What would you use, Bert?
Well, Well, it's 2023. I mean, all we can do today is get a Shih Tzu, maybe.
Yeah. Well, there is. I'm trying to think. We're talking about animal experimentation. We talked about the physical experimentation, but there is actually, I guess it's animal mutilation, because in The Creeping Man, we have Professor Presbury getting deliveries of a serum from monkey glands, basically, a serum of languor designed to rejuvenate him, restore his youth, and they were coming from. I believe they were coming from Prague, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just going from memory here. He would get the delivery, and
sure, it's Lowenstein of Prague.
Lowenstein, that's right, Lowenstein of Prague. So who knows exactly what had to be done to the languor to extract that serum, whether they were those glands were extracted themselves, or whether there was an aspiration of sorts. Whatever it was not kind to the languor.
Yeah, I don't know that glands are really particularly receptive to extract. They don't go out of their way to encounter. Well, left to their own devices, they're not primed for what you might call your extraction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then I think there is what is probably the most egregious case of animal abuse in the canon, and that happens in The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. This happens kind of off-screen, off-camera, off-page, as it were. It was described to us later on. Inspector Hopkins is describing to Holmes and Watson the kind of man that Sir Eustace Brackenstall was. And he said he was a good-hearted man when he was sober, but a perfect fiend when he was drunk. Or rather when he was half drunk, for he seldom really went the whole way. The devil seemed to be in him at such times, and he was capable of anything. From what I hear, in spite of all his wealth and his title, he very nearly came our way once or twice. There was a scandal about his drenching a dog with petroleum and setting it on fire, her ladyship's dog, to make the matter worse, and that was only hushed up with difficulty. Goodness. Setting a dog on fire. I'd say that's probably worse than hurling the dog through the window.
Well, this is what we encounter in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. And from a narrative standpoint, it's very convenient to be able to refer, particularly to off-screen horrors in a sentence or two, that will have the effect of reducing your sympathy for, many of these characters. Witness this particular example.
Yeah. Well, maybe, thinking about a combination of The Lion's Mane and Abbey Grange, maybe Macpherson was concerned about the terrier. Maybe the terrier was on fire, and he hurled it through the window to get it out into the ocean and put out the fire.
Oh, right. Why didn't I think of that?
But here's a challenge for our listeners. Are there any instances of animal cruelty that you can think of that we haven't necessarily covered here in our recounting of these instances of animal abuse? Let us know. Leave a comment on the show notes at ihose.co/trifles345 or send us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. We'd be interested to hear your take on witnessing animal abuse in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Well, that's about all I can muster at this point, Bert. What about you?
I'm as keen as muster, but then I have nothing to add. And boy, that's a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Fudge. Lady Brackenstall's pet dog, let us imagine, dies. It may not be too fanciful to suggest that their poor unfortunate creature was literally killed.
Killed? For what reason?
Reason, I suggest, hardly entered into it. It was done in a fit of insane rage.
By whom?
By a drunken, sadistic ruffian.
One of the murderers?
No, Watson. The lady's husband. The last of the Brackenstalls.
Brackenstall?